Hi, everybody. It's Laurie White back again with another edition of Chamber TV. This is episode number 158. And today we are continuing our series of conversations with candidates that are aspiring to be our next leader, specifically those candidates that are running in the gubernatorial primary for governor. Obviously, gubernatorial for governor, that's redundant, but you know what I mean? It's exciting to be able to talk to everybody and to get a sense of what are some of their big issues? What do they see as opportunities for Rhode Island? What was it that possessed them in the first place to consider throwing their hat in the ring? And of course, we also want to, really salute and express thanks to really capable candidates who are willing to go in and seek public office and to express a desire to serve our state. So with that, I'd like to welcome Democrat Dr. Daniel Muñoz.
Well,
Doctor, good afternoon. Welcome. Nice
good
to see
afternoon.
you. And it's a pleasure to be able to have this conversation with you and get a chance to meet you and
Thank
hear
you.
about what's on your mind. So thanks for joining us. How are you doing today?
Doing well. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share space with you. I'm really grateful.
Thank you. We're grateful as well. So, tell us a little bit about yourself and about your practice as a physician. We'd be really curious to get your perceptions of where we are on this journey that's now known as the endemic of COVID-19.
Right. Yeah, I grew up in Central Falls, Rhode Island, one of five children in a Puerto Rican household. My mother was a single mother, and my father, who was also, along with my mother, my best friend at the time, was struggling with addiction. I reference that a lot because at the time, seeing my father struggle and very much my mother struggle, was influencing my perspective of the world and giving me an understanding of the systems that either were at one point in time or weren't at any point in time serving them adequately and based on their needs. Ultimately, I found myself at the last or second to last year of high school, wondering if I should actually drop out, and had some teachers that were able to identify that the kind of passion I had in my heart could be focused. And what they taught me is that oftentimes the biggest bullies, the biggest you know uh, the biggest forces that we're up against are often in the big buildings. And that was my moment into my pathway into college. I went to Rhode Island College, studied philosophy, did a lot of thinking, learned about ideas in the context of history, and was able to find my purpose in those ideas. I understood that suffering is a part of living. And so at that point in time, I decided that I wanted to pursue a profession that would provide me with a skill set to address suffering, whether it was mental or physical. And I made it to medical school. I say made it because it is a challenging path, and I was fortunate to have been given an opportunity. Studied medicine at the University of Connecticut School of Medicine. Throughout that time, engaged in leadership opportunities, health policy development, also professionalism and honor board uh, roles that I played, supporting remediation processes for graduate students, and also learning about the business of medicine, engaging in clinical technology, and getting a real understanding of what drives the healthcare industry. And the hard reality was that it's not people centered, it's profit centered. So after learning that and receiving my doctoral degree, I eventually came to the conclusion that I wanted to change the way the healthcare system operated, even if it was slightly from outside of it, from outside of the healthcare institutions. So I jumped into industry, immersed myself in development of early stage technology ventures, from medical devices to health IT solutions, helped deploy some systems as a consultant across large hospital systems. And throughout that time, continued to become more frustrated with the lack of change, and really change. When I say lack of change, the lack of adopting solutions that were more affordable, that would improve access to care. That's what led me ultimately, what catalyzed me to really look at political office. And this was in 2016. And that's why I ran as governor in 2018. At the time, I ran as independent. That was primarily to try to confront very much the corruption and cronyism that still exists today across the party systems. But going through that journey and then facing COVID-19, it was an interesting um, lesson for me. And the lesson was that in 2018, I think after losing that race and really being excluded from debates, I became frustrated with the electoral process, and I really felt disheartened by the lack of reception with regards to the institutions that ultimately enable this political game to take place. And then suddenly we're in the midst of a pandemic, and we see leaders not able to address the rapid response measures that needed to be addressed, while simultaneously I was supporting Partners in Health in the state of Massachusetts to build out their contact tracing force, to deploy their vaccination systems. And it was full circle for me. And I grew stronger as an organizer during 2020, and I grew louder as a leader, and ended up entering into the state's equity council, where I've been able to advocate on behalf of communities for a more equitable approach toward the allocation of resources and the building out of these systems, whether testing or vaccination. And then also decided in December that if we are to really create a sustainable, not only healthcare system, but really a sustainable local economies in the coming years, as we face a looming recession, then we need to properly allocate ARPA dollars. And the person that wins this race that serves as governor has to be a person, from my perspective, that is thinking about micro businesses, that is thinking about those minimum wage earners today that deserve a livable wage, and ultimately creating a safety net for the state of Rhode Island to get out of a recession as efficiently as possible and to thrive in the coming decade.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That's a very expansive answer. There's so much in there that I would love to discuss further with you. So let's let's start with some points that you made about when you were in high school, Central Falls High School, the power of a teacher or a set of teachers recognizing your heart and your spirit and being able to really focus you and your passion. That sounds like it was a very pivotal moment in your life that has actually shaped the trajectory of where you are now.
It has. It has. I look back and so many people say if you can just lift yourself up by your bootstraps, and there's such an error with that idea, because there's so many people that work hard every day and they just find themselves, either backsliding because of massive debt that they're collecting to just survive, or in the case of youth that find themselves in a tough environment, not having that unique collision with a mentor, right, that can change the trajectory of not just their life, but their mindset. And I was at a point where I had reached a mindset that perhaps the system, as it relates to the academic system, just wasn't designed to support me as an individual. Perhaps there wasn't really a place for me. And maybe some of that was as a result of what I was overcoming in my own youth and what I had seen and the struggles. But what others would have identified as a chip on one shoulder, a teacher, Mr. Yates and Mr. Scapini, Mr. Shank, and many other teachers, they were really, it was Mr. Yates at that particular time, my English teacher, that I think he realized, okay, so here's this young man who finds himself kind of up against this perspective that the system isn't working, and he feels that there are these bullies, and yet, what he did at the time is he didn't kind of pat me on my head and said it would be okay. He actually took me and placed me in honor classes with some of the toughest intellectuals in the school, who later became my friends. And what I was able to do through those kind of intellectual debates, and by confronting the level of sarcasm that my classmates had, was I was able to understand that the fight starts with words, and then it ultimately ends with action. And the trajectory of my life from that moment through undergrad and medical school was very much a playing out of that story. That I learned the words, I expanded my understanding of ideas throughout the context of history, and then I ultimately followed with action by developing a skill set and an understanding of business and industry as it relates to healthcare, to to place me here today, right? With a lens of equity, with a viewpoint where I can see what it's like to grow up in an economically disadvantaged environment, and also I can see what it's like to access opportunities as it relates to business or opportunities in academia. And I see the disconnect that exists, and I think that there's an opportunity to take time now to connect the dots, to create pipelines out of poverty for Rhode Islanders that are still experiencing that.
Your your background and your work as a practicing physician and also as a doctoral, um, an inventor, an entrepreneur. Those two pieces of your background and your expertise.
So
Um,
I'm not currently practicing. I just wanted to. I'm immersed on the industry side now.
okay, yeah. But having gone through medical school and really understanding the holistic view of the system, everything from the patient experience to the provider experience and the holistic way of medicine today, no doubt has given you a really interesting lens, very interesting profile into what's a very complicated set of systems. And you pointed that out in your introductory remarks. What I'm curious, what is your reaction to what's going on here in the local healthcare industry, particularly as it pertains to the very thin margins of the principal hospital systems and the proposed merger, which we now know is off,
Mhm.
and the fragmentation and the low rate of reimbursement on Medicaid to certain providers. Does that all add up, in your point of view, to something that really destabilizes the industry and in turn makes it more difficult for the lens of equity to shine brightly?
It does. I was very much opposed to the merger. We look at first off as it relates to communication, there was very little engagement with communities that have historically been marginalized, and where we can track the data with outcomes and see that they're not adequately being um, served as it relates to health, community healthcare in particular. In addition to that, we know that historically, when hospitals consolidate or hospital systems consolidate, there is an increase in prices and no improvement to quality. So the narrative around whether equity would be strengthened or cost controlled, it doesn't line up with what the data shows. In addition to that, when we look at the insurance companies and reimbursement in particular, I have had concerns in the middle of the pandemic. It was actually beginning of 2021, I believe, when there were threats, and I say threats because ultimately they kind of pulled back, but threats to increase co-payments for telemedicine in a time where people were taking having most of their mental health care occur through telemedicine visits. There have been threats to essentially bill people for COVID-19 treatments. And then ultimately, the state did take steps even recently as the hospital merger discussions were taking place to create a layer of liability protection on healthcare systems that, again, have not historically not been adequately serving communities, which from a tort reform standpoint, it seems really it's troublesome. So overall, we do have to make improvements. We do have to have cost controls. I think those cost controls happen at the level of supply chain. CVS is an interesting company in that it's here in Rhode Island, and so we don't spend enough time really confronting what healthcare supply chain and cost controls look like, because I think they're minimal at this point in time. Prices for medical products are starting high, and every intermediary company that touches the product before it gets dispensed to patients, to consumers, to us, ultimately adds additional cost to it. So unless we control the cost of products, every other cost in healthcare, hospital operations, staffing, it just mounts on top of that. And this is a global issue, but one that the state of Rhode Island as a state can take more control of. We should be passing legislation where the state as a state takes on procurement, starts negotiating, whether here in the United States or with countries like Canada, for the provisioning of supplies wholesale that are more affordable, that have greater discounts. And as it relates to Medicaid management, I think we should take the intermediaries out of that as well. Too often we look at public funding of programs and we see it just through the lens of it's public dollars and they're increasing and outcomes are not improving. But we have to look at the intermediary private companies that are supporting at an administrative level the dispensation of those funds. And if we start focusing on that, we can see that so much money is being siphoned off from the system.
In your putting your entrepreneurial hat on, you mentioned early stage companies, IT solutions in the healthcare space that would broaden access to healthcare. What are some of the things that you are looking at from that perspective?
Yeah, it's if we're focusing on healthcare, one of the biggest challenges in healthcare is adoption. So, for instance, there are so many great technologies that are shelved because ultimately the early stage ventures that are creating those technologies are limited by what they can do based on available funding. This is something that I think administration after administration over the last 10 years has dealt with in terms of trying to bring additional venture capital, angel investors into the ecosystem. If there's not enough investment, then those early stage ventures ultimately can die off. Right, they'll never clear the regulatory process of these novel technologies. The big challenge beyond that, though, that people often don't fully understand in healthcare, is that the manufacturers oftentimes are acquiring these early stage ventures and the technologies, and then they bring them to market. At least that's the idea. But what's really happening is that the large manufacturers, let's say like a Medtronic, they will either partner with or acquire technology, but kind of what they call shelve it. So it never really gets adopted into the system. There were two different instances. One, I was serving as an advisor where a large manufacturer essentially instructed the technology developer to revisit the technology and to incorporate a disposable element that they could develop a recurring revenue stream from the hospital systems. And this is the game that's being played. I mean, healthcare very much has been gamified for large corporations. And so as we innovate, innovation is being stunted by a lack of adoption or acquisitions that then shelve novel technologies. In Rhode Island, I think what we should be doing is we really need to focus on the innovators. We need to focus on youth. We need to think out of the box as it relates to education. Yes, we need to change our education funding formula, increase the amount of funding per student. Yes, we have a lot of work to do to even talk about how we can reduce statewide administrative costs. But in parallel to that, we should have a statewide after school program that, like Israel did 30 years ago, is providing after school vocational training to students. That doesn't have to be in the traditional sense. It could also be ethical cybersecurity. It could also focus on blockchain technologies and coding with Solidity. These are the industries of the future. And even in healthcare, if you think of blockchain and the use of those technologies in healthcare applications, that's how we get to more efficiency as it relates to claims processing, more transparency as it relates to how systems are managing data across their ecosystems. There's so much potential and there is a need for an innovation culture in Rhode Island. But if we are not investing in people and building up the skill sets from the ground up, we're not likely to attract a large company here that is focused on the technology. And we're also not likely to build the next large company in blockchain, the next Facebook, if that's what we're kind of how we're thinking here. So it's all about the people. And I think we need to be very intentional as to how we're thinking about education, about even free college, like our Rhode Island Promise program, and how we can expand it to non-traditional students and adults that are looking for the next career opportunity. And then lastly, how we're restructuring Commerce Rhode Island to direct itself away from trying to incentivize large companies to come here and focus more so on the micro businesses that are not only sustain our local economies, but that are really at this point housing the next generation of innovators today.
Mhm. Yeah, I love the way you talk about innovation culture, and I'm getting a real clear picture of how you are, how you're seeing your particular skill sets and your expertise in healthcare, and how it might relate to again the innovation economy and the need of our education system to really help support that. So I do want to let's kind of break those two off into pieces, and let me ask you about the K to 12 system. And this is a perennial issue. I can't say that in my time as head of the chamber that there's been a period where we haven't talked about it as a critical need. But I'm wondering, the call for dramatic action. Are you of the mindset that we need a longer school day, a longer school year, perhaps school year round, early, pre-K, and then early education, meaning from a time perspective all the way through. And you mentioned, after school programming. Are these the kinds of solutions that you think need to be brought to the table? And more to the point, um, what would you be able to bring to the table to help make these things happen? Because a lot of these reforms have been discussed, and it's frankly been an intractable problem. So how would Dr. Munoz address that from an adoption point of view?
Yeah, certainly nothing happens overnight, but I think too often, especially around election cycles, capital infrastructure seems to be the focus of discussion. The narrative that the roof is falling seems to be what is latched onto, and the need for a leak to be repaired, and that is a real issue. Mold is a real issue, and we're seeing it around school systems. But ultimately, we have to also think about, like, how is that narrative masking a real problem in our education funding formula? We have an education funding formula that really, while it was designed to be equitable in terms of how it's structured, is not equitable. It doesn't weigh the many characteristics of what a student is confronted with that may find themselves in an economic hardship. It isn't only about whether they have free lunch or discounted lunches. It's also whether they have needs for language services. It's whether they have learning disabilities. Are they gifted? And so how are we going about weighing those various characteristics of students and then adequately supplementing additional funding for students that have those additional needs? If we are not doing that, which we currently aren't doing that effectively, then what we're ultimately doing is just really concentrating poverty. We have an education funding formula that displaces accountability from the state to municipalities. And because municipalities have different property tax rates, ultimately that the consequence of that is that schools are funded differently, and the state isn't making up for the gaps. So when we think about how we move forward, it isn't only about fixing the buildings, it's also fixing how we fund education and ensuring that we're giving everybody an equal opportunity to a quality education. And then beyond that, what can be radical and what we should be thinking about, we should be thinking about, what does the next 5 to 6 years look like? And is regionalization of our school systems an actually a necessary step to reduce the administrative costs that we're expending to ultimately start to balance this budget out per se, while not sacrificing quality any longer, which has always been the first thing sacrificed, I think. And second to that, I do think that we should start thinking about an after school program, not from the perspective of a one off, but a statewide after school program, an after school program that has a mandatory civic service component where students can start applying the vocational skills that they are learning in parallel to their traditional education. And let's not just limit it to vocation. What about soft skills? What about cultural sensitivity? We have amazing, diverse cultures, and it just seems that our towns and cities are drawing lines between our students, making it harder to build that next generation of, 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 of innovators that will ultimately either make or break an innovation culture. Because culture isn't about one person. It isn't just about Providence or Westerly or Central Falls. It's about all of the towns and cities coming together and coming into an agreement, right? That ideas and the collisions that our ideas can bring, will serve the best interests of the next 7 generations here in the state of Rhode Island.
You talked about agreements, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are about how you would go about embedding some of these innovative solutions, approaches, et cetera, in the K to 12 space, as you were just mentioning, how to embed those into the various teacher union contracts.
Yeah, I think it's important to acknowledge that because we're talking about how to create change, that change always happens locally. If we're thinking of what that means from the ground up. We can talk about municipal governments, but even more so, let's talk about school committees. Let's talk about how we're collectively working with teachers, students, and parents to think about where these opportunities are for greater collaboration and for innovation. I've said previously, when we think about professional development, we should think about how much we're expending on professional development, and then also how that professional development is not only serving teachers, but how it's also serving the community that surrounds the school system. I'm a big believer in community service overall, and if we could replace PD hours with more community service hours to have greater engagement and more of that relationship building with teachers and communities, I think that is going to strengthen advocacy from the ground up. And ultimately, like I said, that's where change happens. I don't want to discount all the other stuff that we need in the K through 12 system. I think every child should have access to pre-K. I think early childhood development screening should be in place, and we should adequately fund that. I think that parents need additional resources, access to affordable childcare. I think that we should have innovation around parental leave, which, when we think about what that means for households that have multiple children, it can actually improve the quality of home education that's taking place for students that may be in school while the parents also at home. We This isn't just about what it means to be progressive in our way of thinking. It's the fact that we know that if we create these programmatic changes, the quality of life for every Rhode Islander will improve, and thereby the quality of services that are being provided by the Rhode Islanders that are engaged in industry will also be improved. So if we can start thinking holistically here in the state of Rhode Island, I think we're going to have a state that everybody wants to come to. We're going to set a precedent around the country for how the federal government can start to look at Rhode Island as a case study for the implementation of progressive programs. And I hope that anyone listening understands that this is feasible. It's just about connecting the dots.
We've talked about healthcare, we've talked about the education system, we've talked about higher education, we've talked a little bit about entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial thinking. So let's continue on with that theme, and we have about 3 minutes left in our first discussion with you, and we'd love to have you back. But let's pick up on your thoughts about really imbuing that innovation culture. What kinds of supports do you have in mind for young companies, small companies that are looking to hatch an idea and perfect it and move it through the pipeline? We know that that's where most of the ideas get stalled and clogged because the capital isn't there necessarily to see it through to adoption, to see it through to first revenue. What are you thinking in terms of how we might further stimulate that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I look at the CIC building in Providence, and the simplest addition to that space would have been adding a trolley that goes to South Providence and back. There are entrepreneurs everywhere, and whether they're starting a small apparel company from their apartment, or they are trying to work on some ASIC chip from their home, and accessing products that they can purchase through Amazon just to try to have a proof of concept. They're everywhere. They're everywhere. And if we are not actually connecting the dots, if we are not connecting the transportation hubs in this example to the areas where the few investors that are in the area visit, to the areas that were designed to promote and foster innovation culture, then that is a small step that we've missed with a significant impact, and not a good impact, a negative impact. So I think that we should not lose sight of the simple things, of the idea of meeting people where they are. Second to that, I think it is important to think about how we support micro businesses in ways where we're creating a supplemental wage program for businesses. We are working with Commerce Rhode Island to redirect its attention to the idea or initiatives that would allow the state as a whole to create packages of licensed software programs that companies in various verticals of industry would essentially need to do their project management, to manage their financial books, and also thinking beyond that, to really run an AWS, Amazon Web Services, right, for the early stage, software solution. This is how we get these companies that may need $5,000, the resources that are worth $5,000 at least, sub-licensed by the state or licensed by the state, and then ultimately allowing them to use it through contract. But that's how we get these micro businesses the support they need. And in addition to that, again, some type of supplemental wage program for those small businesses that do have employees and that are not at the point where they are going to, have an upward trajectory with $10 million of revenue, but hopefully where they're at least generating, somewhere between $1 and $2 million, and supporting their employees along with their support would give them a pathway to scale their infrastructure. So reducing their, the need for them to use resources for the additional wage or supplemental wage, and then allowing them to use it on capital resources instead. So I think there are innovative ways to do this. We only have 3 minutes, so I was kind of like trying to fit some in here, but I hope that at least gives an idea of what steps we can take.
Yeah, we can go over a little bit, not a problem. What would you, I'm thinking about, your powers of persuasion and what powers you might bring to the forefront to assuage or, really comfort and reassure the public that yeah, these are all essential investments that need to occur at the micro business level, whether they be wage supports, as you mentioned, or supports for licensing, and helping companies really birth something meaningful and giving them sufficient runway to be able to do that. But inevitably, not every business will reach the end of the pipeline, and they will, in fact, some of them won't survive. Do you think that we as a society have, very little patience for that kind of long-term thinking and the ability to be able to absorb risk without polarizing any kind of dynamic?
I don't know if it's an issue with society or historically with the extent of cronyism that we've experienced in our political system. There has been a history in Rhode Island of picking winners and losers, and when we talk about failed companies, I mean, 38 Studios is often mentioned, but there's so much capital that goes into relationships that never bring their vision to fruition, and yet there are so many micro businesses that have the potential to be the next great one. And by not acknowledging that, what we also fail to do is we fail to see that minimum wage earners in this state are having a hard time surviving. And if we're not supporting the micro businesses that can be the next great business, we're also not supporting the many people who have the potential to maybe get into Rhode Island Promise because they're so caught up in surviving and having two minimum wage jobs, that is. We may be pushing them out of the state. And when you start to do that, when you create a condition, an environment where people do not feel like they can survive there and they start to leave, what does that do to the overall culture of a state, or the overall culture of a city or town? I think it breaks it. There was a book in the early 2000s called Bowling Alone, and it talked about the deterioration of community. And in that time, or across those charts, it also talked about the importance of social capital, of how these technologies, these ideas that are coming to light, whether you're looking at social media or blockchain, is a means to bring people back together to show that we can have redistributed wealth business models. And I think the state should have that same approach. So I continue to say, what are we investing in? It is the next 7 generations. Therefore, who are we investing in? It's Rhode Islanders. And if we can look at that, even if we're looking at it from a skills perspective, we can start to see that the micro business that can barely pay the tangible asset tax today, if they could get an exemption for 2 years and get some wages supplemented for their 5 employees, that restaurant surviving through the next recession could be the next big restaurant, the chain restaurant. And we, as even if individuals feel that that is divisive and they do not want to look that far ahead, as leaders, as public servants, we need to think that far ahead. And that's what I'm focused on doing as governor of Rhode Island.
Mm-hmm. I see some parallels between your your view about what you experienced as a young high school student when somebody, isolated you and said, hey, we see great promise. You could be, you know, the next big leader of the world. And then what you're describing as well on the business side, the micro business side in terms of, growing a company, investing on the early stage, and then seeing if those seeds can actually produce the next big Amazon, if you will. So your thought process is very consistent.
Thank you. Well, it's what I believe. So, yeah.
So
Yeah.
we have like a minute left. So let me just ask you to wrap up by telling us how's it going on the campaign trail. What's a day in the life of Dr. Munoz look like as a candidate for governor, and what kind of traction are you getting?
Yeah. Thank you. Traction as it relates to engagement and reception across Rhode Island, individuals across municipalities, it's been positive, very positive. Running an outsider campaign, pushing against establishment politics, political family dynasty dynamics, and also pushing against the platitudes that fail to acknowledge the programmatic changes that I've just mentioned that we can make. It does lend itself to a situation where it is hard to fundraise. That is not stopping me or the campaign. We're pushing forward, and our goal is ultimately to win during the primaries. Now, one of the challenges that we see in the near future are the televised debates, which previously in the last time I ran were an issue. There are some gatekeepers that are present, but this time, my approach has been very different. Anyone that is ever thinking about running, I would just share these words of encouragement. There will be a moment. There will be a moment, whether it's a political operative or whether it's in your own mind, when you think to yourself, should I be tempered? Should I withhold just a little of the truth that I feel in my heart? And I would just recommend that you not do that. I think it's important for us to lean into the hard truths. We are not out of this crisis, which is COVID-19, and we are facing a global crisis that is going to put stress on supply chains and stress on economies, and that is globally. We need to have the perseverance and the strength and the truth to withstand hard times. And as governor of Rhode Island, and with the work I've done, both in clinical operations and even in terms of advocacy, I'm committed. I'm committed to the state, to the people of Rhode Island, to the next 7 generations, and to ensuring that our economy survives what is to come, and beyond that, that the economy itself can thrive.
Dr. Munoz, thank you so very much
Thank you.
for being with us. We are chatting with all the major candidates who are seeking the office of governor in Rhode Island. We will continue to do that here at the Greater Providence Chamber of Commerce, and just do that in a spirit of getting to know one another and being open about ideas and different points of view, and really thinking through some of the real challenges and opportunities facing Rhode Island today. So we truly thank you for
Thank you.
your willingness to share and to be part of this dialogue with us. And we invite you to come back again as the campaign continues to roll on, and we will continue our discussion with you and see how things are going on the campaign trail, and get you to react to some of the issues as they continue to develop, whether that be the war in Ukraine or what we're going to potentially see with new developments on the hospital mergers front and acquisitions, also on K-12 education, and our favorite topic, which is really stimulating small business and helping small businesses grow and thrive. So with that, thank you everybody for
Thank you.
joining us. Thank you, Dr. Munoz,
Thank you
and
so much.
we will see everybody again. Take care.